I'm Jono Buchanan. In this video, we're going to look at two approaches to kind of maximizing the top end of our tracks. We're going to look at what happens when we use high shelf EQs, and we're going to look at what happens when we use the Exciter plugin. We're going to learn what the differences are between those two approaches, and we're going to find out which one maybe helps a couple of tracks within the project that we're working on. So before we go any further, let's just have a listen to how the track sounds right now. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Now, I've got a few different tracks within this project, and we're going to be focusing on two of them down at the bottom. This is a drum track, and this is bass, and then what I've got is this kind of slightly fuzzy, nice sounding sort of sequence sound, which has got a lot of brightness in it, which is nice, and then underneath that, what I've also got is this kind of mallet pattern, which is down here at the bottom, and both of these sounds are quite bright. Now then, I said at the very beginning, we're going to look at two approaches to maximizing the top end, or the treble, or the brightness of our tracks. And one of those, of course, is simply by using what we call a high shelf EQ. Let's take this synth part here, and what I'm going to do is to put a Logic's channel EQ on this track. Now, what you'll see when you open up the channel EQ is that effectively at the top here we have these different coloured bands, all of which allow us to change the frequency footprint of a sound in different ways. The middle bands are what we call bell curves. They allow us effectively to select a particular frequency area and either turn it up or down by pushing this up or down. And as we make that adjustment, firstly, we can see the frequency that's being adjusted, we can see the volume adjustment that's being made to it, and we can see what we call the bandwidth, which is effectively how wide the band is. We're in a position to make what we refer to as surgical changes, where we take a very narrow band to find maybe problematic frequencies and turn them down, or we can make sort of broader band changes, which means that a wider group of frequencies is affected. And what I can do at any stage is simply hold down Option and click on any of the parameters that I've selected to return them to their default states. But or at least on either side of these bell curves, which occupy these middle four bands, outside of that we have what are called shelf filters instead. And rather than setting a sort of lower and upper frequency area around which we're boosting or cutting volume, what shelves do instead is effectively progressively add volume above or below, at the low end, a certain point. Now, again, we can also cut volume above or below a certain point, but what I want to do is to make everything in this mix a little bit fizzier, a little bit airier, a little bit brighter. So what I'm doing is I'm selecting the high shelf, and you can see that what's happening is I get a slope which never comes back down again. Effectively, it rises over a particular frequency area, and then volumes above the sort of point here will continue to stay louder, unlike bell curves, which obviously drop away at an upper frequency threshold. So what I can do with a sound like this is to make this sound airier and brighter. I'm going to just solo it by punching in this high shelf EQ. Let's have a listen to it. Okay, so we get all this fizz and all this extra air. I've got a little click on the end of these audio regions because of the way that I've cut it up. So I'm just going to put a little fade out on the end of each one. But what we've now got is this extra fizz. Now, whenever you're EQing a sound, yes, it's a good idea to A-B it like we just have with a sound soloed so you can hear the difference. But of course, EQ is all about context. How does this sound relative now to the rest of the mix? Well, let's do the same thing again, but this time not in solo mode. So we have a chance to hear this EQ as it's punched in and out in the context of the track. Okay, so crucially with this change, what we're doing is we're taking the existing frequency content which exists within the sound, and we're adding more volume to a particular frequency area. Okay, well that's working nicely. It's probably a little bit over bright, but it's making the point that we're trying to make. Now then, I mentioned at the beginning another way of being able to sort of add extra top-end information and maybe extra sort of fizz to a sound, and that's to use the Exciter plugin. What I'm going to do is to bypass the channel EQ, and what we're going to do instead is to drop down here to the specialized folder where we'll find the Exciter. Now, an Exciter plugin also adds fizz and extra sort of quality to the top of a mix. Let's just make it a little bit bigger, but it does it in a different way. So whereas EQ takes the existing frequency areas that exist within a sound and allow you to turn their volume up, what an Exciter does is to artificially add additional harmonic content on top of a sound. In other words, a bit like a synthesizer, a bit like an oscillator within a synthesizer, what it's doing is adding more value, more content, if you like, to a sound. And it's doing that above a certain frequency point. So effectively what it's going to do is to add extra harmonics, extra fizz, extra sort of quality to a sound. And it's going to make it fizzier and brighter, but it's not just turning up the volume of bits that exist already, it's adding new bits to the top end of a sound. So the Exciter plugin is pretty simple. What it allows me to do first of all is to set the frequency above which I'm going to be adding frequency content. I'm going to move this up a little bit to maybe something a little bit nearer sort of 5 kilohertz or 5,000 hertz. What I then have a chance to do is to decide how many additional harmonics I want to add. The higher this dial goes, the more harmonics I'm going to be adding, and therefore the more content we're adding and the fizzier the sound will become. And then I've got two options in terms of the kind of color of those sounds. Now, I also have a chance to audition this, let's solo it again, with the dry signal, i.e. the original sound, on or off. So when the dry signal is on, I'm going to hear the whole sound, including this new harmonic content. And when I turn it off, we're effectively just soloing the new harmonics we're adding at the top end. Let's start with the whole sound. And then what we'll do is we'll audition this by turning this button off, so we're just hearing what's being added. What we can also do is just experiment with these two different colors. Okay, so color one is a bit more detailed and sort of full sounding, whereas color two is a little bit more subtle. So how does this sound in context? I'm adding a lot of extra harmonic content, again, just really to make the point, and I've dropped this frequency band a little bit from where we originally started. Let's put this back into context, and again, what we'll do is we'll just A/B this. I'll just turn on and off this effect. Okay, so you can hear there's a massive difference. The thing about the Exciter is that it almost takes on a sort of doubling quality, almost a bit like a phaser or a flanger, that kind of extra effect that we get, all of the original sound plus this extra bit, and that's what you'd expect. We are, in fact, if you think about it, adding a signal rather than simply enhancing a signal that exists already. But it's definitely worth thinking about if you want more fizz in your components, the component tracks of your production, thinking whether or not an EQ or an Exciter is the best way to go, because whilst they have some characteristics in common, they're also very different effects. Now then, we've got two sort of bright sounds within this mix. I'm tempted to try the same pair of effects on this other sound as well. What I'm going to do is to take this track, which I currently have selected here, and what I'm going to do is to add both a channel EQ. In fact, I've got a channel EQ on the sound already, but I'm just going to add this one underneath this glass mallet patterns track here as well. And I'm going to bring the Exciter down here under the existing plugins. And what I'm going to do this time is to solo this And again, just try out these two different things. Now this mallet sound is different. It's a kind of glassier sort of sound. It doesn't have this super smooth top end. It's a slightly more bell-like sound. And that's going to have different implications, particularly for the way that the exciter is going to work, I think. So let's just listen to it as it stands right now. And then what I'll start doing is introducing both the EQ and the exciter. Okay, I really like this effect, particularly with color 2, which is again this slightly more subtle thing. I'm adding a lot of extra harmonic content, but what it's doing is it's taking this sort of upper mid-rangey bell-like quality and it's making it just fizz a little bit more. What I'm tempted to do is to keep the exciter on this sound whilst putting the EQ back in on this fuzzy Logic synth. Now, one word of warning, particularly when your ears get tired towards the end of a mix day, what they crave is this kind of sugar boost, which comes from adding treble. And whether or not you're working with EQs or whether you're working with exciters, you're just going to get that immediate sort of hit, really, of all of this extra fizz. It's going to make the mix sound bright and wonderful, and suddenly it's going to feel like it's got a new lease of life. And then you're going to come back tomorrow and listen to your mix and wonder why it's so over bright. So be careful with that. But what we've got a chance to do here is to hear these two effects side by side. So next time you're looking for a little bit of extra fizz within your mix, bear in mind you've got two approaches that you might take. Within this video, we've looked at both of them. This idea of using a high shelf within the channel EQ plugin and comparing that with the exciter plugin, which remember, isn't just turning up the volume of frequencies which exist already. What it's doing instead is artificially adding more on top to give you this kind of more synthesized approach to generating extra top end.